fancy name for what we're going to talk about is called meta-ethics. Okay? Sometimes people say just ethics, but in philosophy, more technically speaking, ethics is actually the field that studies specifically like which things are right and wrong. Okay? Like, is it wrong to let a patient stop taking medicine that you know will save their life? That would be an ethical question. Okay? And an ethicist is the person who attempts to answer that question. Okay, meta-ethics, however, is the field of philosophy where we decide, we try to figure out the more deep issues of what would make anything right or wrong in the first place. Okay, not which specific things are right and which specific things are wrong, what ought we to do, but where does oughtness come from anyway? Okay, where does rightness and wrongness come from anyway? Does this make sense? The difference there? Okay, and it's that latter question that's more important for us worldview-wise. Okay, and in fact, a lot of these debates that people have about ethics, like should abortion be legal? Okay, should the United States put its stamp of approval by sort of legally extending marriage to homosexual couples? Okay. Often the debates that we have about those specific issues, it's like people are just talking past each other and they're like not actually even having a discussion because they disagree on the meta-ethical level. They disagree on the worldview level. And they disagree so fundamentally that they have really no place of agreement to stand. So they're just like shouting their slogans and propaganda at each other. Okay? But if you actually want to really make any progress on solving, on getting somewhere with those specific sort of hot topics, okay, you really need to dive into these deeper things. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay, so there's 3 basic positions. Okay, we'll go through them really quickly. Okay, and again, remember that the basic idea here is not for us to learn all the ins and outs of these different philosophies, but just to sort of do a broad brushstrokes portrait of the way that people, in fact, in this society do think, so that when you meet somebody in evangelism or just in conversation, you'll at least be able to say, like, oh yeah, I've heard of that before. Okay, I'm familiar with that idea. That, I can see where you're coming from. And I can see, like a lot of times I think when people meet someone and somebody says something, they have to stop and think like, oh, I don't know whether I agree with that or not, right? Hopefully by thinking about this, you'll at least have a sort of preliminary like, oh no, I've heard about that and I know that I disagree with it. Or I've heard about that and yeah, like that's what I think, right? And that might be able to inform your conversation, okay? So there's 3 basic meta-ethical positions, okay? It's called consequentialism. Alright, deontology, and virtue ethics. Somebody from Virginia. Whenever somebody from a 703 or a 571 area code calls me, it's always somebody who doesn't speak English. Like, every time. Because I have a 571 number, but so it's like Northern Virginia, but like the only people that I know that have numbers like that are my family. So every time it's a wrong number, and somehow every time it's a wrong number from somebody who doesn't speak English. Okay. So consequentialism says the thing that makes an action right or wrong is the consequences, the outcome. Okay? So why is murder wrong? Well, murder is wrong because people are hurt by it. In the first place, the person who died. Okay? But in the second place, there's so much suffering from the family and whatnot. Okay? I'm going to go through all these super quick, and then we'll loop back and do it in more detail, just so you can kind of get the broad outline. Deontology, deos, means duty. Okay? So deontology is the study of duty. Okay? And deontological ethical theories are those that say what makes something right or wrong is the inherent duty to do something or to not do something in the action itself. So consequences don't matter. Murder is wrong because you have an absolute duty to refrain from murdering people. Period, end of story. Regardless of what the consequences or outcome is. Okay? Does that make sense? Third is virtue ethics. Okay? Virtue ethics says that what makes something right or wrong is most fundamentally a person's character, their virtue or their vice. So the right actions, in other words, virtue ethics says both of the first two are wrong because they're focused on actions rather than persons. Okay? Once we shift our focus, however, the virtue ethicist says, we can see that what's ultimately of value is virtue and vice. And the reason certain actions are wrong is because they either promote vice or they flow from vice. And certain actions are right because they either promote virtue or they flow from virtue. But the most fundamental thing, the thing that really is sort of the value-bearing piece of the puzzle is virtue and vice, character. Who you are, not what you do. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah? Alright, so let's loop back around and see how this works. Okay, the most popular form, there are several kinds of consequentialism, okay, but the most popular form is utilitarianism. Okay? Utilitarianism says the outcome, the consequence that we're concerned with is utility. And what is utility? Utility is the net benefit minus harm done to everyone concerned. Okay. Now there are various kinds of utilitarianisms. Okay, I won't go into all the nitty-gritty details, but the basic premise is that everybody is equal as far as being an individual that is capable of receiving benefit and harm. Okay? Utilitarianism is based on a kind of egalitarianism. Although not necessarily. I could come up with a non-egalitarian utilitarianism, but that would be like non-standard. I don't know anybody who thinks that. Okay. But the basic idea is, okay, everybody concerned with the situation is a basic unit. Okay? And us as units, we're the kinds of things that can receive benefit or we could be harmed. And think of it this way, that we can measure that benefit and that harm. Okay? So if I do 5 units of benefit to Mike by my action and only 1 unit of harm, and I do 4 units of benefit of Isaac by my action and 2 units of harm, okay? But then let's say I do 6 units of harm to Solomon, but also 6 units of benefit. So for Solomon, it's like flat even, it equals out. I hurt him a bunch, but I also benefit him a bunch. Okay? On the whole, though, the net of that is there's more benefit there than harm. Right? So I should do it. Make sense? Rather than refrain. Okay? Even though I do harm Solomon 6 units, and actually I harmed all of you a little bit. Okay? But on the whole, there's more benefit. Okay? And what I should do is I should look at all of my options, all of my possible ways of acting, and I should try to calculate what is going to be the net utility for everybody concerned for each of these options. And I try to pick the option that has the highest utility. That is the highest net benefit minus harm. Alright? So to put it really simply, I'm sure you guys have heard this before, the greatest good for the greatest number. Anybody ever heard that before? Yeah? What should we do? Well, we should do the thing that has the greatest good for the greatest number of people. That's utilitarianism. Straight up. Okay. Does this make sense? Alright. Now, classic problem with that way of thinking is that, as a matter of fact, it turns out that there are certain things that we might do that might benefit a very large number of people a lot, and yet fundamentally violate an individual. Okay? So a classic example of this would be, imagine that we're in a society in which there are red people and blue people, and they're both racists, both groups. Okay, the red people hate the blue people, and the blue people hate the red people. The society has 1,000 members in it, and there's only 10 blue people. They're an extreme minority, and there's 990 red people. Okay, and because both sides are racists and they hate each other, the red people would all get pleasure from torturing the blue people. Okay, so let's say by torturing the blue people, you do them, say, each of them 100 units of harm. That's a lot of harm. Okay, so you total 1,000 units of harm by torturing them all. Okay, but you would do all the red people 10 units of pleasure, of benefit from the entertainment that they would get. Now, the entertainment that any individual red person gets from watching the blue people be tortured is, pretty small. Okay, comparatively. But there's a lot more red people than there are blue people. Right? So the greatest good for the greatest number would be to torture the blue people. But we think that's wrong, right? Why do we think that's wrong? Because you're violating them, right? So we kind of tend to think that, no, it doesn't really matter like what consequences you get out of certain actions. You just plain old can't torture people. Right? So this is where you can easily see that ethical dilemmas get set up. Okay? So for instance, in a wartime situation, let's imagine that we've caught a terrorist, okay, and we're pretty confident that if we apply this like horrific torture method to them, they will divulge where the bomb's going to go off. And we're pretty confident that there is a bomb and that it's going to kill 100 people, say. Do you torture them or not? A lot of people would say, yeah, of course you torture them, because you would save 100 lives, as opposed to, and you'd only torture to death. Let's say you actually have to kill this terrorist. You'd only torture to death one person, right? But then a lot of other people have the converse intuition that says, no, no matter what, people are gonna die. Okay, they might die today of a bomb, or they might die tomorrow of cancer, but you just can't torture people. Okay, that's just not allowed. We have to find another way to try to save those people, and the ends don't justify the means. Okay. Also, I should throw that in. Typically, if you're a consequentialist, you're often a person who thinks that the ends justify the means. That it's okay to do things that are bad if, in the end, you achieve more good because of it. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. There are other forms of consequentialism, though. All right. The two biggest ones are egoism and altruism. Okay. Egoism says the action that I ought to take is the one that provides the greatest consequences for me, the best consequences for me. Ego, I. Okay. Other people be damned. Okay. I'm sure we all are familiar with this. And as a matter of fact, remember we talked about worldview, what do people actually say with their mouths, and how do they actually live? As a matter of fact, this position is probably the one that the majority of people actually live in the majority of their actions. Is they think the thing you ought to do is the thing that will get you ahead the most. Don't worry about other people. That's on them. Right? Look out for number one. Okay. Now, that's kind of a crude egoism. You might mix that with a slightly more sophisticated, there's sort of an egoistic utilitarianism. There's a brand of utilitarianism that's kind of egoism. And this goes something like this. Well, people are pretty rational, and they know a lot about what benefits them. But they're often pretty wrong and mistaken about what will benefit other people. And so on the whole, the best benefit for a society will happen if people do what they want to do as individuals. And if everybody just kind of chases their dreams, even at the expense of trampling on each other, on the whole, that will be better than a society where we all try to sort of engineer for each other the best outcome. Right? It's actually, there is some wisdom in that. Okay? I think it's a screwed up worldview, but there is some wisdom in that. Okay? Altruism is the reverse of egoism. Altruism is the view that says one ought to do that which has the best consequences for other people, regardless of what it does to you. Okay, so this is often the you can kind of see this in the worldview of maybe like a mother who just kind of wears herself out, ragged for her kids. And the whole thing, like her whole worldview is dominated by my kids have to go to college, my kids have to succeed, my kids have to have a better life than I have, and I'm willing to like run myself into the ground to get those consequences. Right? Make sense? And honestly, if we're just looking empirically at psychology, the way that normal human beings actually behave, usually their decision making is actually a mix of egoism and altruism. Okay, but in certain sectors they're very egoistic, but then at like certain crucial moments something flips in like a crisis or something like that, and they flip into an altruistic way of thinking. Right? People are inconsistent. Fact. Okay? Deontology. Again, deontology says the thing that is right is the thing that you have a duty to do. And the thing that is wrong is the thing that you have a duty to avoid. Okay, well, where do those duties come from? The deontologist says, well, they're inherent to the action, the nature of the actions themselves. It doesn't come from the consequences. It has to do with the nature of the action itself. Okay, so murder to the deontologist would be wrong even if you could save 100 lives by killing someone. It's still wrong because it's murder, period, end of story. It doesn't matter what the consequences are. You see the difference? Okay. Now, how do we know which actions we have a duty to do and which actions we have a duty to avoid? Okay, that's where the different kinds of deontology split and there are different versions. Okay. The most popular version, though, and the only one we're going to talk about, is Kantianism. Okay, and Kant has something called, say this again.
Social contract.
No, Kant was not a social contract theorist. He did not think that. Okay, the category. Yeah, sorry, I just had like a brain freeze there. A categorical imperative. Okay. Why is it called categorical imperative? Well, because there are these things called hypothetical imperative. A hypothetical is an if-then. So we talked about this a couple days ago. If you want to succeed in business, then you ought to dress for success. You don't have an absolute duty to dress for success. Nobody has to wear a suit. But if you want X, you should do Y. That's called a hypothetical imperative, because it only has its force. It only gets its should from the if part. From the, like, assuming you want this is what you should do. Okay? Well, Kant asked the question, hey, is there anything that I should do without an if? That just full stop, you should do it, or you should not do it. I don't need to assume that you have certain goals or certain plans. Okay? And his answer was this. Yes, there is. The categorical imperative is that there are actually three statements of the categorical imperative in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. Okay? Essentially, what you ought always to do okay, is to respect the rationality of other rational agents. And because of that, always treat them as ends in themselves and never merely as means. Okay? Now the way you can say that is to act only on that maxim which one can will to be universalized. Okay? It's a tricky sentence, let's parse it. Act only on that maxim that one can will to be universalized. What's a maxim? A maxim is a rule for action, like don't lie, don't murder, do give money to charities. Okay. Consider a maxim, a rule for action, that I couldn't will to be universalized. And what do I mean by willing it to be universalized? Could I choose a world in which universally everybody did in fact follow that rule of action? Okay? Think about a world in which everybody murdered. Systematically, everybody, when they had the chance to murder somebody, they did it. Could I rationally and realistically choose that world? Would I want to live in that world? No, I wouldn't. Okay? So somehow, the idea, okay, it's a little complicated, but hang in there. The idea is, I am then, if that's true, if I wouldn't want to live in a world where everybody acted that way, I am being irrational by acting under the converse, or I'm being irrational by acting under that maxim. If I go out and the rule for my action is, when I get a chance, I murder people. But I don't want other people to do that. I don't want to live in the world where that's the rule. Okay? Then I'm being irrational. Okay? I'm taking something and saying, here's the universal rule that I want everybody to follow, but I'm not a somebody. It doesn't apply to me. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? So the duties in Kantianism, okay, duty comes from rationality and from consistency. Okay, so we got a little technical there, but the simple version basically is act rationally. Okay, duties are the things that rational people, perfectly rational people would do. And the things that you have a duty not to do are the things that perfectly rational people would avoid doing. Rationality being universal consistency. Okay, make sense? Yeah. I don't think I've yet really explained the connection between the first formulation and the second formulation of category. Leave it to you guys to figure out why Kant thinks those are the same thing. All right. Okay. Virtue ethics. All right. This is Aristotle. Or Aquinas. Right. Virtue ethics says, okay, human beings are the kinds of beings that have habits. We form habits. Okay, so we form dispositions to act in certain ways. Okay? When those dispositions promote the excellence or an excellence of a human being, those dispositions are virtues. When those dispositions to act in certain ways promote the falling apart, the like lack of excellence in a human being, those dispositions are vices. Okay? So for instance, just really simple example, if I have the habit of brushing my teeth twice a day, on the whole, that will lead to having good teeth. Right? And so that habit is a virtue. Whereas if I have the habit of never brushing my teeth, then my teeth will start falling apart. Okay? So that habit is a vice. Okay? Now notice this is somewhat different than consequentialism. Okay? Although it has to do with consequences. Okay? It's not so much the particular consequences of this particular action. Okay? But the tendency on the whole for certain modes of acting and behaving and being a certain kind of person, having certain habits, lead to flourishing of human lives as wholes. Okay?
Could you just form that in as benefits and harms of action? The fact that you would think the same way and you would do it in a different situation.
Yeah. Except that the goodness of being a certain way doesn't derive from its consequences. Okay? There's rather sort of a symbiotic relationship between the nobility of the consequences and the nobility of the kind of person who does those things. Okay? So, for instance, why shouldn't the red people torture the blue people, even though it seems like you'd get a lot of benefit? And let's even say that the red people get 100 units of pleasure for torturing them. So I mean, just like make the good consequences like through the roof. The virtue ethicist would say it doesn't matter, okay, because you would have to be a wretched person to take that course of action. And being that kind of person, no matter how much benefit you get from it, is awful, right? Being the kind of person who would choose to torture other people for fun, even if it's only one or two of them, and even if lots of people have a great time because of it, makes you a terrible person, right? So I'm sure you've heard this talk, okay? I just couldn't live with myself if I X, right? And why do people say that? It was because I realized that if I did X, I would be that kind of person, and I just I couldn't go to sleep at night knowing that I'm the kind of person who could pull the trigger under those circumstances, right? So that's why I didn't do it. That's why I think you shouldn't do it, right? It's because imagine the kind of person that you would be to do that. Versus, imagine somebody who stays at home and helps their sick mother, and they're thinking underneath there, it's because I want to be that kind of person. So, and often they'll express it as, I just couldn't be the kind of person who would send her to a nursing home. Right? And so it's not really a calculation of cost benefit. And it's also not really do you really think that there's a universal rule like thou shalt not send thy mother to a nursing home? No. It's I am the kind of person, and over my lifetime I've built up the disposition of caring for my mother, and I just couldn't, I don't want to be the kind of person who would have sent her to a nursing home. Does that make sense? Yeah? So that way of thinking through things, that's a virtue ethical way of thinking. Okay? Now, there are a couple of related ideas. Okay? Natural law and eudaimonism. Okay, let's start here. Eudaimonia is, write that in. Eudaimonia is the Greek word for happiness or total flourishing of a human being. It often gets translated as happiness, but it's important to realize it's not an emotion. It's not something that you feel. It's not a momentary thing. It's sort of the total success of a life. Okay? So there's a version of virtue ethics that is kind of consequentialist because the virtue, and this is Aristotle's, okay, which dispositions are the virtuous dispositions? They're the ones that lead to eudaimonia. Okay? Not the greatest success or greatest happiness for the greatest number, or greatest benefit for the greatest number. But the virtues that you ought to cultivate are the ones that lead to your eudaimonia, your total success as a human being. Now, some of those it might be the case that human beings, psychologically, they're just so constituted that we need to occasionally do self-sacrificial, loving actions to other people. We need to be in community, we need to give our lives to other people if we want to be in that state of full, total flourishing. Okay? It might be the case, and actually this is a common objection to egoism, philosophical egoism, is that if you're really an egoist, if you're a thoroughgoing egoist, you ought to be an altruist sometimes. Right? Because people who are like super thoroughgoing egoists are actually get really unhappy and lonely and don't have any friends. And like it's like a really nasty place to be. So if you really were out to like help number one and like have a good life for yourself, one of the first things you should do is drop the philosophy of being out for number one and having a good life for yourself. Right? So it's sort of self-defeating in that way. But eudaimonism is a little bit different, okay? Because it's not systematically, I always and in every situation I ought to do the thing that benefits me and nobody else. It's, on the whole, I should act according to dispositions that are part of the total flourishing of a human life. Some of those dispositions might be self-sacrificial dispositions. Some of those dispositions might be loving, communal dispositions, because that might be part of human psychology. Okay. But still, the thing that's value conferring on everything else, the origin of where does the value come from, is eudaimonia, the total success of the human life. Does that make sense? Okay. This is related to a natural law idea, which is that every, and this is kind of a typical Catholic ethical position, everything in nature, because it's created by God, although you don't have to believe in God to believe this, everything in nature has a telos, has an end, has an objective. And because of its nature, there are certain things that are good for it, and certain things which are bad for it. Okay? And this is true of humans just as much as it's true of trees. Squirrels. Certain things will make that squirrel do well. Certain things are bad for that squirrel because it'll make that squirrel not do well, not achieve its end. Okay? Now, the slight difference between sort of Thomas Aquinas' brand and Aristotle's brand is that what's good for human nature is fundamentally ordered beyond human nature. It's ordered to God. Okay? So the goal, the ultimate success of and full flourishing of human nature is not sort of self-contained. It's only in standing in the right relationship to God. Thomas thinks it's the beatific vision. That the culmination, the best thing for human beings, what's good for human beings, is standing in that like God relation. Make sense? So the virtues for St. Thomas are going to be those dispositions that promote that end. Right? And the vices are going to be the ones that hinder it. Okay? Regardless of, in the moment, what the specific consequences are. Right? Although, one of the virtues might be practical wisdom, to, under certain circumstances, be able to calculate, hey, what's likely to make us the most money? Right? Not doing foolish things with your money. Does that make sense? Everybody get it? Okay, ask me some questions. We're done.
Virtue ethics, the only category compatible with Christianity?
Yeah, I haven't really addressed which of these is the Christian option. One brand of deontology would be a certain version of divine command theory, which I haven't talked about. Well, I shouldn't do that. Divine command theory is there are certain actions that you have an absolute duty to do, and certain actions which you have an absolute duty not to do. What makes them duties is just the fact that God commanded thou shalt here, and what makes these duties, or like things that you shouldn't do, is just God commanded thou shalt not. So the origin of the ought is God's command. And the origin of the not ought, or ought not, is God's command, negative. Okay. Now, the reason I think divine command theory is no good, and a lot of people do, is because you can easily ask the further question of like, okay, well, why would God command thou shalt not murder? If you're a thoroughgoing divine command theorist, you can't say because it's bad. Because if you say, well, because it's bad, then you have to say, well, why is it bad? And if you say, because God commands us not to, then you're in a circle. Okay? So if I ask a thoroughgoing divine command theorist, why did God say thou shalt not murder? He's got to say, there is no reason. He wanted to. And then I could ask, well, could he have commanded thou shalt murder? And if you're a thoroughgoing divine command theorist, you have to say, yeah, he could have commanded that, and if he had commanded that, that would be the thing that we have an absolute duty to do, go murder people. So there's nothing inherently, really, right or wrong about murdering people. The only thing that makes it wrong to murder is just the sheer fact, sheer inexplicable fact that God commanded us not to murder. Okay. I actually think Luther thought something like that. And he thought that it was a feature of just God's freedom. He was a voluntarist. So he thought that, yeah, God just in his freedom just decided how it's going to be. And that's what makes it good. Period, end of story. It doesn't come from his character.
It could have been like evil. Like,
well, no, it wouldn't have been evil.
Well,
yeah, it would have been good.
Or what we would currently perceive as evil. God.
Yeah. And if he had decided to be that way, that would have been goodness. Of course, when we say that, though, immediately we're like, no, that's not right. But I think Luther was just sort of so impressed, one, by God's power and his freedom, and two, with man's inability to reason about that. Right? That he just went out of his way to say, like, no, man, if God he could have done it completely differently, and he's God and we're man, and so you have no place to say that he couldn't have commanded, thou shalt murder. Right? But I think once we take a step back from the sort of hot-headedness of that claim, it's not good theology.
So, back to the original question. So, would you say that virtue actually exists in compatible Christianity?
Well, that's what I was saying. It's like, I think Luther was a Christian. You know, I just think he was wrong about this thing.
Do you think it would be a consequence?
You know, there you go. So like J.I. Packer says that he's a Christian hedonist.
Whoa.
And and there are like some moments in C.S. Lewis, right, that are kind of like this too, right? That like, it's just that we're wrong about what's really pleasurable. And so we're over here chasing after what we think are like the good consequences, when really like the good consequences is just like the pleasure of knowing God, right? And the pleasure of loving other people. There's something right about that, but I think that ultimately, again, that's getting the order of explanation wrong. That the reason why loving people is pleasurable, and the reason why knowing God is pleasurable, is because those things are good. And God, in his mercy, has designed us to take pleasure in good things and displeasure in bad things until we go and break the mechanism. Like in sin, we get ourselves messed up so that we end up taking pleasure in bad things and displeasure in good things. But I think fundamentally our psychology is set up to take pleasure in the good things and displeasure in the bad things. So it's not that things are good because they give us pleasure, it's the other way around. Things give us pleasure because they're good. And so then, again, same with the divine command theory, we're still left with explaining why are they good, right? And I think they're good because they're good. Like they participate in God's goodness.
Is hedonism like a subset of concept feature?
Yeah, hedonism is just hedonism is a particular spin on all of these consequentialist theories. It's saying that the consequence that we're actually most concerned with is pleasure and pain, right? So, for instance, John Stuart Mill's version of utilitarianism is a hedonistic utilitarianism. But there are other versions of utilitarianism, because I might say, no, the consequences we care about is like money, or the consequences that we care about are, you name it, all kinds of good things. There's preference utilitarianism. The good things we care about is just whatever people happen to prefer, right? Whether it gives them pleasure or not. So yeah, hedonism is not itself consequentialism. It's just a theory about which consequences matter to us. Make sense?